Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, esteemed panelists, uh, distinguished audience, those who are physically present here, and those who are digitally connected with us. Welcome to the United Service Institution of India. We are doing this event on a very contemporary subject together with fair observers. The CEO, Mr. Atul is here, and also with NICE Nepal, which is a new and a very energetic think tank. I'm very happy that we have a very distinguished panel from India and abroad. Unfortunately, due to COVID, our panelists from Russia and China, they've not been able to join us. So we'll have to do with panelists from US. Then we have Mr. Atul Singh, who is on to my left, and he's the founder and CEO of Fair Observer, which is a very, very analytical think tank. They have about 2,500 contributors from 93 countries. He's a multifaceted personality, educated in India, abroad, has a lot of operational experience as a police officer, and also taught at the University of California. Now, coming on to the topic of the day, this topic is very familiar, but just to put things in perspective before we have expert views on the subject, we know that the Cold War altered the geopolitical map of the world. And after the fragmentation of Soviet Union, there was a unipolar moment in which United States of America resorted to preemption and what you call is either you are with us or you are against us kind of a mindset. And at that time, they had made certain pledges that there would not be any extension of NATO, to the extent even Russians were looking forward to joining NATO and be part of a overall European security alliance system. At that time, when the NATO expansion started towards Eurasia, George Kennan, in an interview, was prescient when he said that this is the beginning of the new Cold War. That means the expansion of NATO eastwards. Now, that definitely has impacted Russia's self-image and its national security concern, and then came put into the center stage, and you know his leadership styles and things like that. So Russia has taken a certain strategic trajectory, which is for all of us to see. In the meanwhile, another very important event happened, and that was 9/11. And there, United States of America was again uh, nudged to look towards different alliance and partnership, and that is how that global war on terrorism started. But concurrently, a fundamental assumption of US on China that they will become an international stakeholder under a US led international order, that assumption proved to be wrong. And Chinese, because of being an old civilization, it had a mind of its own. And it started asserting for a strategic influence in the Indo-Pacific. It wanted to be accommodated in the new world order. And from there, the contestation started. While US started, pivoting to Indo-Pacific, there was a strategic alignment between Russians and Chinese in Eurasia. And post withdrawal of US, I think both the countries hold a total sway in the Eurasian landmass. In the Indo-Pacific, things are in a state of flux. While the NATO is being reinvented and re-energized, there are some amends being made to Euro-Atlantic Alliance. Still, there are question marks about the efficacy of the US East Asia Security Alliance system. All these things are in a state of flux. And post COVID-19 pandemic, rather than the world collaborating, some of these contradictions have got further compounded, we know. And as we stand today, there is a contestation over the ideology, strategic locations, resources, trade, technology, and influence in the global institutions. That is where different players are vying for influence. And in the meanwhile, the middle level powers and the smaller powers, they are aligning and realigning their positions depending upon their geopolitical interests. So at the center of this whole Cold War, new Cold War, you have the two protagonists, that is US and China, and there are other strategic alignments which are taking shape. And in this milieu, the role of middle level powers like India, Australia, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan becomes very, very important. The way the whole geopolitical scenario is panning out, it is causing a lot of dilemmas for India. We have to make certain strategic choices. Now, what those choices are going to be, are going to discuss. In the meanwhile, there are flashpoints which can trigger a conflict. What is happening in Ukraine now, a recognition of this eastern Ukraine by Russia and the economic sanctions by European Union and US. We don't know how this is going to pan out. Second flashpoint is, of course, Taiwan, where Chinese are resorting to strategic coercion. They're upping the ante there. And then there are unpredictable players like North Korea and all, who from time to time, keep flexing their nuclear muscles. And you have some issues in East China Sea. So therefore, the whole strategic scenario is in a state of flux. How this is likely to pan out, whether this Cold War is something what happened in the past, or is there some new dimension to this? We are going to discuss this subject.
All right, thank you, Ambassador Singh. Thank you, General Sharma. It is a real honor to be here. My parents are sitting in the first row, and my Singaporean friends are also sitting in the first row, so no pressure. And my brother, of course, was the better debater. Both of us debated for Oxford, and he was the better debater. So he's here as well. So clearly, no pressure today. Anyway, I'm supposed to speak about, is the new Cold War a myth or a reality? And as I was taught at Oxford, try to break any topic down into 3 questions or 3 points. So what are the 3 questions for today? Number 1, what is or what was the Cold War? Then the second question, what is the new Cold War? And then the third question, which is really the topic, we get into the heat of, we get into the meat of it. I apologize for the vegetarians. The steak and bones analogy may work very well with Christopher, who's sitting in Washington and is a Texan, but may offend some sensibilities. But the meat of the matter is really, is it a myth or is it reality? Is the new Cold War? Is it just a souped up media jargon, or is it something which is real and tangible and substantive and has major implications for the future? Now, question 1, what was the Cold War? Very simply, the Cold War was competition between the US and the Soviet Union. And this competition began almost immediately after the end of World War II, when they were both allies. And of course, it was a marriage of convenience. There was very little in common between the Soviet Union and Great Britain, or for that matter, the United States. But they all teamed up because Nazi Germany was a clear and present danger. It had invaded all sorts of countries. And at the end of World War II, the old rivalries resurfaced as the British Empire collapsed and American influence spread worldwide and the dollar became the reserve currency of the world. The Soviet Union was the only counterpart to American power. And this Cold War that began 1945-47 lasted until 1989-91. And we have Armenians here who have some experience of that period, who speak Russian, and they would add a very welcome addition to the discussion. Welcome, gentlemen. Now, this competition was military, it was geopolitical, and it was ideological. Military, I don't need to tell you about the nuclear scare that went around that time. For decades, American school children did drills. What would they do in case of a nuclear attack? I'm sure the Russians did that too. There was, of course, geopolitical competition all the way from Latin America to South Africa and indeed the African continent and to Asia. In 1953, America conducted a coup against a democratically elected Iranian president because of fear that he might be communist or he might be a socialist. So there's real fear. And that fear led to American adventures and misadventures. 1953 in Iran, a case in point, trying to prop up a failing and flailing French regime in Vietnam, another. I could go on till tomorrow, but you get the point. Similarly, the Soviet Union in 1956 crushed the Hungarian uprising. Then in 1968, it was the Prague Spring. So both sides played cat and mouse with each other. Both sides were competing for dominance in different theaters. The Cuban Missile Crisis is perhaps the most spectacular incident of that time, when, of course, the Soviet Union started stationing missiles not too far off Florida. And at its essence, this was a rivalry about global domination. There were two universalist powers battling for global supremacy with nuclear arsenals deployed at each other. Both of them had parallel universes. They weren't really trading much with each other. Both of them believed that their economic system, their political system was the final state for humanity. And in fact, when the Berlin Wall falls in 1989, and when the Soviet Union itself implodes in 1991, Francis Fukuyama in 1992 writes about the end of history. Now, as we know, history never ends, at least for those of us from the old world. Anyway, so much so for what was the Cold War. Let's get on to what is the new Cold War. Now, there's a chap in Chicago. We have somebody from Chicago here. He would be pleased to hear that. Russell Stamitz is here. Welcome, Russell. There's a chap from Chicago. His name is Professor John Mearsheimer. Now, those of us who've had to do our staff colleges, as some people have, and go to fancy universities and get fancy degrees, have to study these big names. And Mearsheimer is a jolly good chap. He's actually quite a decent lecturer. And he's also a provocative writer. And Mearsheimer argues that a new Cold War has broken out between China and the US. Now, what does he mean? What does this sage from Chicago mean by this term, the new Cold War? Well, he argues that an intense security competition that touches on every dimension of the US-China relationship has emerged, has broken out. And again, I'll try to break it down into three neat categories. After all, as they say, structure is the foundation of all knowledge, or the organization of knowledge, a matter for another debate. But the three realms are military, economic, and technological. Now, military, well, the US has 800 bases around the world. The US has fought a number of wars around the world. The US has the ability to project force around the world. It has logistical support for operations anywhere. It has a nuclear arsenal, of course, but it also has delivery mechanisms in terms of missiles, fantastic technologically cutting-edge planes, and of course, a fleet that patrols the seas and brings what many would say a global public good. The global security is guaranteed by the American military. And some would say China is starting to challenge it, at least in its near neighborhood. China is increasing its military budget. China is building up its navy. China is flexing its muscles and claiming little pieces of islands and flying planes in record numbers over Taiwan. And perhaps most worryingly, the Russians and the Chinese sailed their fleet around Honshu, the main island of Japan, which might be considered slightly provocative. It might be analogous to someone with a pistol walking up and down outside your door. Now, some would be very comfortable with it. Maybe Christopher, he'd step out for a gunfight. He's Texan after all. But shall we say a nice vegetarian Jain, as Russell's wife happens to be, may not be too pleased with somebody with a pistol outside her door. So that was a touch provocative, and it might be fair to say that a limited military competition is certainly emerging. It is certainly on the cards, and in its near neighborhood, China, emulating Russia, is following a policy of asymmetric warfare, meaning, all right, yes, you control the seas, but we can send a lot of cheap rockets over and sink some of your ships. We can do other stuff which will cost pretty less, but will cause a lot of damage. It is the workshop of the world. It can churn out lots of things at high speed. And yes, it may be blitzed in a high intensity, full-scale war, but it may have some cards up its sleeve in its near neighborhood. So a certain military competition has broken out, and an assertiveness under Xi Jinping is certainly clear. Let's look at the economics. I checked the Office of the US Trade Representative's website just before I started speaking, because I wanted the latest figures. In 2020, the GDP of China was $14.9 trillion. In 2020, the US GDP was estimated at, say, $20.9 trillion. These figures may be a bit here and there, but let's round them up to 15 and 21. $15 trillion for China, $21 trillion for the US. Obviously, in per capita terms, the US is a far wealthier country. But China has a GDP which certainly is not to be sneezed at, which means there are only two things really that determine a country's military power. One is, does it have the economy to support war? And two, does it have the will to fight? And China seems to have the economy, certainly today, to fight a war, to have a bish bash bosh. Does it have the will to fight? We don't know yet. Lots of single children, and as we know, single children don't really do very well in a punch-up, as we discovered not too long ago on our own borders. So we'll see whether they have the will to fight. They certainly have followed a wolf warrior diplomacy. So we don't know. If it's all bark and no bite. We will find out. But now let's get to US-China trade, because the key thing we're talking about right now in the economic argument is whether economically these two sides are pitted against each other in two parallel universes, challenging each other that their system is better than the other, as the Soviet Union and the US did, or there's something more going on. Well, 2020, the US-China trade amounted to $615.2 billion, of which US exports were $164.9 billion and imports were $450.4 billion. You can do the mathematics. US is still running a trade deficit against China, despite the trade wars of Donald Trump, despite all the bluster of Washington about containing China. It seems to be in an abusive relationship with China and can't get out of it, at least economically. So trade between the two countries is extremely interwoven. And the damage, well, of course, China would suffer tremendously. The damage to China would be catastrophic if all-out trade war breaks out, or if there's all-out war, as in World War II. But the damage to the US would also be considerable. And the US economy is overextended. It is deep in debt. It has structural issues, rising inequality. Lots of people have fallen out of the job market and they are not counted in the unemployment numbers. Lots of regions are under stress. A few industries have emerged and a few companies have emerged in a winners-take-all model. So if there is a trade war, a number of Americans are going to suffer and they will suddenly have to pay a far higher price for cheap household goods. So inflation would go up dramatically. Already, tension with Russia is pushing inflation figures up, and that's a big challenge all across the world. But in the US, stimulus, and Christopher can speak more about it. He was on Capitol Hill. He ran for Congress last year, and Christopher can talk more about the internal economic constraints of the US right now. Such a trade war would be extremely expensive. And in America, politicians like Christopher, if they get elected to Congress, are facing election every 2 years. So the question is, can America take the pain? Can America get into a punch-up? The American military certainly can, but if there's a full punch-up, the economic costs to China would be catastrophic, but to America won't be negligible either. So economically, it is a bit of an abusive relationship actually for both parties, because China does not want dependence on the US either, which is why Xi Jinping has been trying to turn around the economy, which is why he's betting big on high-tech sectors. He's trying to stimulate domestic consumption. He's trying his best in an imperfect way to rein in the real estate speculation without crashing the economy. So China is trying to restructure itself from an export-based economy, an export-oriented economy, into an economy with more domestic consumption. Now, just so that you have an idea of the scale of dependence that China has on imports, back in the day in '79, if I remember correctly, and here please forgive me because I may be off by a bit, I've written about it, but suddenly I forgot to write down in my notes what was the percentage of exports in '79. I believe it was 4.5%. My Singaporean friends are extremely rigorous. They can correct me if I'm wrong. And I think at some point in the '90s, it had reached over 30%. Now, the moment your economy has over 30% of exports, you're extremely vulnerable to any shock. Add to that dimension the fact that China relies on outside sources for energy. China does not have its own oil. China does not have its own gas. As in World War II, it is extremely vulnerable, like Japan and Germany, to anyone cutting off energy supplies. Why was Hitler making a dash both for the Caucasus and for North Africa at the same time, which was a ridiculous blunder? But the reason he was doing this was because he knew German tanks would stop rolling if they didn't have access to oil. And China knows it doesn't have access to energy. The Straits of Malacca can be cut off. The pipelines that they've built under the Belt and Road Initiative across Central Asia can be blown to smithereens. Ipso facto, of course, the cancellation of Nord Stream 2, and the ambassador was right. The ambassador was bang on the money when he said we couldn't have chosen a better time to have this discussion, because at a time when Nord Stream 2 has been cancelled, Putin has no option but to jump in bed with Xi Jinping. Vladimir Putin now is going to be very much in the pocket of Xi Jinping, because now Russia's oil and gas exports are all dependent on one market. So for now, despite their competition in Central Asia, despite their boundary disputes, the Chinese and the Russians seem to be coming closer, just as Austria, Hungary, and Germany came closer together before World War I. But I'll get to that in a minute. That's something that has been preying on my mind actually for weeks and months. I've discussed this with many people in the audience, friends and colleagues who are here, and with people who are offline. But the reality is that we are seeing a very complicated global economy with interdependencies, and the untangling of which would be painful, if not, and certainly difficult. Now, the third dimension of the new Cold War is technological. And when it comes to technology, we know that there is an American-led universe where the likes of Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple and Netflix and, of course, Twitter dominate, and Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, Meta now. These are the big giants of global data, of global information. If the Americans want to know about anyone, of course, it's the American companies. They can have the back key to anyone, and it's fantastic. Data is the new oil, as The Economist once said. And one universe is, again, akin to the United Nations, but unlike the United Nations, privately led, extremely efficient, extremely cutthroat Silicon Valley companies having global domination, and by that implication, upholding American power and the idea of a rules-based international global system, which of course was inaugurated after 1945 by the US, Bretton Woods being part of it, the whole edifice, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations, all being part of that construct. And China, on the other hand, says, hang on a minute, we don't need Google. We don't need Facebook. We've got WeChat and TikTok and Alibaba and Baidu, and thank you very much. We'll have a great firewall of China. And we are going to start betting big on the technology which you've mastered. And we are going to have a separate system. And whilst doing so, we are going to steal industrial and scientific secrets from around the world. The number of cases, prosecution cases, that the FBI has brought in for espionage is at a record high. I believe the number, as Glenn Carl, my co-author who retired from the CIA, said, was something like 400. Again, apologies if I don't have the exact figure. I'll have to dig that out. We can dig that out later. But the key thing there is that these are notoriously hard cases to bring into court, which means that China is sending thousands of scholars around the world to come back with technological expertise to kickstart high-tech, cutting-edge projects. And there, certainly, even David Petraeus, General David Petraeus, who retired as the CIA director, who was interviewed with me, the interviews on YouTube, talked about we are in the foothills of a new technological Cold War. So the final question, and this is the last question, and after that other speakers can take the floor, is the new Cold War a myth or a reality? And as the French would say, it's complicated, you know? With the French, everything is complicated, isn't it? We don't have French people in the audience today, so I can have them as a scapegoat, serves them right. But the key thing here is that, look, the US and China were tacit allies during the last half of the last Cold War. The CCP basically shifted from the Soviet Union to the US. Of course, we know that Mao didn't particularly like what he saw the big brother attitude of the Soviet Union. We know how Henry Kissinger went to China and then Richard Nixon followed. We know that once Mao died and Deng took over in 1978, he said remarkably that it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. We know that none other than the great Lee Kuan Yew, the visionary leader of Singapore, said that Deng was the most impressive leader in the 20th century that he'd encountered. And he said because he had the ability to change his mind, which is the most difficult thing for any leader to do. And Deng's 1978 revolution, and after that he bet big in 1992 with Nangsun. He went on a southern tour and he said, we are going to go full throttle into the markets. Remember, 1992 was a worrying time. Why? Because 1989, the Berlin Wall falls and the Tiananmen Square protests erupt, which are crushed, brutally crushed. 1991, the Soviet Union falls. There is internal debate in the CCP. Should we close shop? Should we hunker in? Should we get into our bunkers? Or should we double down? And Deng says, double down. Like James Bond on a casino table, he throws in all his chips. And guess what? 1992 onwards, China grows. And of course, Mearsheimer says this policy of engagement in the hope that China would become a part of the liberal world order was the biggest strategic blunder the US has ever made. Because Mearsheimer is a realist and he blames those who believed in the universality of the liberal order for being stupid about it. Because powers clash. Big powers are like big boys. They have a bit of a punch up, a bit of a dust up. And Mearsheimer says, of course, the clash was inevitable. But in the heady days after the Berlin Wall fell, there was a genuine belief that it was the end of history. Clinton was an inexperienced president, wasn't a particularly sophisticated foreign policy operator. And China basically grew. And 2001, everyone thinks of 9/11. Oh, and I have gone to a number of young diplomats and trained them, and particularly in Asia. I say, okay, why was 2000, South Asia, particularly if you ask them, why was 2001 important? They all answer 9/11, the attacks in New York and Washington. But 2001 was also the year China entered the WTO, as those in East Asia know very well. So America got distracted for 20 years in Afghanistan, in the deserts of Iraq, whilst China put its foot on the accelerator and said, thank you very much, we'll grow. And of course, until Xi Jinping came along, China followed Deng Xiaoping's maxim, which was bide your time, hide your strength. And they did it very cleverly. They understood that they were vulnerable at the Straits of Malacca. They understood that, yes, they were growing, but their per capita income was low. They understood that their military had no combat experience since 1979, when they went head to head with the Vietnamese and ended up with a bloody nose. So the Chinese understood that. But with Xi, the progressive liberalization, even of society, the increasing ease that you had of doing business basically went down. And now the CCP has transformed Marxism into consumer capitalism, whilst at the same time choking personal liberties. There's no hint of democracy. Xi is cutting off access to the outside world. He's defying the US-based international legal norms. He's encouraging a very shrill, frankly, immature wolf warrior diplomacy. Reminds me of Kaiser Wilhelm before World War I. He's also enforcing orthodoxy, whitewashing history, and oppressing minorities. He's now the head of his nation for life. At the same time, the US, to use the words of another academic, his name is slipping my mind, the US is suffering from Brezhnev-like paralysis. US democracy has always been fractious, turbulent, and messy. Those of us who grew up in India understand that. We come from a similar country. But the challenge that has happened is that the US now has a lack of strategic vision, and different parties are too busy fighting each other than operating with some semblance of sanity. Now, some could say that the US has always been fractious. Punctuated equilibrium is the natural state of affairs. This academic has said it. And of course, China has decades of stability punctuated by protracted upheavals when authority fails. And the examples are, and I'll quickly wrap up, the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864 took 20 million lives, 5% of China's population, which even at that time was a very densely populated country. And you could argue that it took until 1949 for China to stabilize. It's only when the CCP led by Mao takes over that China stabilizes. In contrast, the American Civil War, which lasts from 1861 to 1865, killed 750,000 combatants, 2.5% of the population of a much less crowded country, and America was back on its feet pretty quickly. And so you could argue America is more resilient, and China has internal contradictions and external enemies. Having said that, the key thing here is that the die is cast for great power rivalry again. The Thucydides trap that a certain professor at Harvard has talked about is back in play. Whether a ruling power and a rising power can coexist remains to be seen. We have seen what decades of hurt, and I've written a very long article with Glenn Carl, a retired CIA officer, about Vladimir Putin's long game. I encourage all of you to read it. So I don't want to talk about Russia. I spent yesterday talking in television studios about Russia. But today, the focus is China. But what Vladimir Putin has demonstrated, that if there is hurt, if there is anger, things can erupt. And China certainly has hurt. There is a mythology of a century of humiliation at the hands of the white man. And of course, the US was one of the powers that participated in the humiliation of China. And the US, of course, has this belief that China is a malignant power. It is a communist country that doesn't allow liberty and democracy and threatens key allies such as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and so on and so forth. So the die is cast to see how the Thucydides trap plays out. And we certainly are headed for a new Cold War. It may not appear because of the economic ties yet. And if leadership in Beijing and Washington acts unwisely, it could easily slip into a hot war too. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Compliments to Mr. Atul for a very, very comprehensive and insightful perspective on the Cold War, whether it is a myth or a reality. And in his concluding remarks, I think he is very convincingly said that we are really into a real Cold War. It's no more a myth. And it could, if there are certain miscalculations, it could lead into a hot war kind of a situation. Our next speaker is Mr. Christopher, and I couldn't see him that time online. So now I have the privilege of knowing him through Atul and also introducing him. He's a very young, budding senator to be in the future. he is a policy advisor, and he has a tremendous experience at the Capitol Hill, working with 3 congressmen and also advising Pentagon a number of policy issues. And he ran for Congress in 2020 for a special election, and he intends running all over again in 2024. So may have your perspective. How are you looking at this Cold War, and particularly the recent developments that are taking place from your perspective, please? You have about 10 minutes. And
yes,
then we'll
all right. Thank you, General.
Elaborate question answer session. Okay.
Okay. Well, I suppose in the wake of Atul's discussion, I have to go back to the no plan survives first contact. I had some remarks prepared, but we're going to deviate from that, so bear with me. I do maintain that we are in a new Cold War, though the contours of it are different from the last one, and frankly, few lessons apply to our current situation. However, I do think that the present Cold War need not be outwardly hostile. And I also think the past is not entirely devoid of prologue. So if we are in a new Cold War, how do we know that? Cold Wars don't have formal declarations. And so the question to some degree is a question of sentiment. And I'll go to a couple of studies briefly. Last year, a study by the European Council on Foreign Relations found that a third of Europeans believe the EU is in a Cold War with China. They had a lot of undecideds. Fully a third said they didn't know. But almost 2/3 believe the US is in a Cold War with China. And I'm starting off with China because that's sort of the new Cold War. Friction between the US and Russia has been there a long time. You may recall, was discussed earlier, Mitt Romney discussed Russia as a great geopolitical threat. The Wall Street Journal tomorrow will have an editorial that says the 80s got their foreign policy back, which is how President Obama responded. But the Europeans perceive America as decidedly being in a Cold War with China. That comports with a Pew study that was done early last year. And that found that Americans favor tougher stances toward China on issues ranging from human rights to economic concerns. And to confirm that, the same Pew report said that 67% of Americans have a quote unquote cold feeling toward China on what they called their feeling thermometer. So even accounting for maybe a moderation in those feelings, given the antipathy felt with COVID, I think it's still safe to say that the US citizenry certainly perceives China as a threat and believes we are at the very least in a cold standoff. What is interesting to me is there is a disconnect in what I've seen in the last year between the populace and the politicians. America's legislative agenda has recently leveraged Sino-American apprehension to introduce and pass bills that are full of tangentially related items. So much of what we're passing, or at least discussing, is more or less spending on preferred voting blocks. For example, the House of Representatives has a bill they call the America Competes Act, and it's full of environmental messaging and labor giveaways and loan guarantees and extraneous measures. And this bill also effectively mimics Chinese centralization of industrial policy, much like the Build Back Better and the infrastructure bill we passed. So in short, the American people think we're in a Cold War, but for the legislators, we're in a golden age of pork. Now, I want to address that because Atul brought up an interesting point about spending ourselves into oblivion, which America is most certainly doing. He talked about the size of our economies. One interesting thing to note, by one measure, purchasing power parity, China is already a larger economy. Or at least more affluent. This is a pork that we can ill afford. It also leads into that will to fight, but we have a lot of domestic concerns right now. When you look at what's called the U6 of employment, we have a tremendous number of people who could work, who aren't, who have decided not to look for a job for whatever reason. Some of those reasons have been attributed to easy money from the federal government, a lot of lenient policies perhaps. And we're also in the midst of inflation, where the cost of goods are going up and the labor participation rate is not where we would like it to be, particularly when you look at that U6. Domestic concerns predominate, and that is clear by the legislation that we're passing. It's also interesting the size of these bills. So back in the financial crisis, I was on Capitol Hill. And what we thought of as one of the most monstrous packages ever passed in terms of just sheer size was the $787 billion ARA, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, also known as the stimulus. These were numbers that people thought were mind-boggling, Republican and Democrat alike. Then we fast forward to COVID, and we had $4 trillion spent under Trump, and we've had, a number of other trillions, $3 trillion in the last year spent by President Biden. 2 of that was for a COVID relief bill, and 1.1 of that was for an infrastructure bill. These are numbers that America can't sustain, and they especially can't sustain it in the face of rising treasury rates, a function of inflation. So this all plays into the will to fight, our preparedness, an erosion of the military's budget. And an interesting thing about that, we have yet to pass an NDAA, which is an annual sort of priority bill for the military. Yet the Pentagon released their climate change plan last week, I think it was. So do we have the will to fight? Do we have the means to fight? That's a question. I will say that in Middle America, the threat of China is real, from the factory worker who worries about his job being offshored to China to the CEO who worries about cyber espionage or intellectual property theft. There is a strong wariness of China. Markets that were once too big to ignore are increasingly thought of as too risky to join. But curiously, there is, as Atul mentioned, an interconnection with our economies that people can't fail to recognize. So this is not the Cold War of yesteryear. Not that long ago, Americans perceived Russia as the greater threat, but Trump kind of shifted that focus, and he did so with trade rhetoric, with asking NATO allies to pony up and meet their obligations. But what Trump did not do particularly well was cultivate strong relations with world leaders. Now, you contrast that with the current administration, which boasts stronger relationships and is perhaps more willing to use the resources of NATO and more willing to work with NATO. But this current administration has faced a dizzying number of setbacks, not least of which was the bungled withdrawal from Afghanistan. So Trump was a blunt instrument, but Biden has had a lot of poor execution. We've also had unforced errors that have left our allies confused and frustrated. The Trans-Pacific Partnership withdrawal under Trump was a concern and has left an avenue for China to potentially exploit. And America's promises are increasingly viewed as more whims than obligations. And so that concern seems justified. I mean, we are in an introspective moment where I think America is asking itself whether the old values upon which the country was built are still valid, whether or not they're worth fighting for. And that, that leads to a lot of navel gazing in stateside. But this is not just a Republican or Democrat thing. From Trump's America First program to the wokeism of Democrats, it's across the parties. Look no further than to this year when we spent all of our floor time on the House and the Senate talking about an expansion of the social welfare system in a voting rights bill. So I don't know that there's a lot of will to get involved. We pulled out of Afghanistan, and I don't think Americans especially want to get re-embroiled in something. Meanwhile, the Chinese are making focused, concrete moves that achieve immediate geopolitical ends, and I'm consistently amazed at the international concerns that permit China to pivot and sort of play the game. I think of COP26, where there was that last minute agreement with the US and America that kind of salvaged that, in my opinion, debacle. And they knew how to get brownie points for doing very little, making promises that were pie in the sky and they knew didn't amount to much. And they must absolutely marvel at that, while they also marvel at how America is just spending itself blind. I will say wolf warrior diplomacy appears to be a failure. Vaccine diplomacy is hollow. Mistrust is everywhere, and why not? I mean, from the building of the artificial islands that were promised they wouldn't militarize while they were putting up runways and radar. Hong Kong is a shadow of itself in contravention of the joint declaration. Taiwan feels threatened. Japan is intimidated. Atul referenced Honshu. To say nothing of those harassed at the 9, 10, or whatever it is, 11-dash line. So this is not how you win hearts and minds. The Quad and AUKUS are a direct response to this growing instability. And while the Quad is broader than the Security Pact of AUKUS, both are aimed at fostering greater agreement and providing a coordinated front in the face of greater global instability in a more assertive China. It's worth noting that the Australians were willing to sacrifice a little bit of their relationship with the French, and the Indians are also leery of the Chinese. Let's not forget, India was more closely aligned to perhaps the Soviet Union than us back during the Cold War I. And now they're looking for new partners. And one of those partners is America vis-a-vis the Quad. Skirmishes in past years have created growing apprehension in India, including the one skirmish where 20 Indian soldiers were killed. Interestingly, those skirmishes have been internationally reported and may seem small to a lot of people, but they get more press than you would think. I don't want to take more than my time, so perhaps I'll leave it at that. But it is a question of our willingness, our financial capability, and the sort of alliances that we're building. The hope being that in constructing these alliances, we will be able to spread out some of the weight of quote unquote policing the world. And I think that ideally will lead to greater stability. And I could go on, but I think I'll leave it there because I'm out of time.
I just have a follow-up question
Sure.
here. So you'd like to kindly elucidate. See, Putin has thrown the gauntlet now, and uh, there were problems that you were facing in the Euro-Atlantic alliance in terms of Germany and France, going their own way and trying to cut certain deals with Russia. But now probably European Union has got consolidated. 27 countries plus Britain, they've all gone for a sleeve of economic sanctions against Russia. Now, at the same time, if Putin pushes the envelope further, there may be requirement of a military response, though you have already ordered some troops of NATO to be deployed. Is there some kind of a consensus developing in the American political leadership to have a holistic or kind of a unified approach to deal with this crisis? Or is it going to be a divided house as it's been in the past, compounded by a very high inflation rate that you're facing? So if you were at the helm of affairs, how would you deal with the crisis?
Sure. You opened up a whole bunch of cans of worms. First of all, I think Germany's being brought kicking and screaming to this consensus. Keep in mind, the UK had to fly supplies around Germany so that they wouldn't get rejected or embarrass Germany or create a problem. Germany killing or suggesting they might do something about Nord Stream 2, I think that might have been a response or at least an effort to prevent Biden from jumping in any more than they wanted him to. Now, will the U.S. supply soldiers? Certainly not in a direct conflict in Ukraine. There is very little appetite for that. However, would the U.S. contemplate, and is Biden contemplating, armament of some kind, call it a Lend-Lease deal? I don't care. Are they contemplating that? They very well might be. And there was an effort, as you recall, somewhat staunched by the Germans to provide supplies to the Ukrainians. The German contribution, as you might know, was 5,000 helmets. Thank you very much. But I think there would be a willingness to arm the Ukrainians to some degree, but not in terms of personnel. An important note here is that the consensus is a little bit fractured. It falls down unusual lines, with Republicans in some cases arguing that Ukraine isn't worth fighting for. There's a sort of Tucker Carlson phenomenon out there. He's a news anchor, where you do see some Republicans saying we shouldn't get involved with Ukraine. That's a break from past stances. But I think there might be the willingness to provide things to Ukraine, but it will be held at an arm's length. And I also want to say that I thought Biden, in coordination with the UK and perhaps others, did a good job of preempting some of Putin's moves by saying he wants to install a puppet government. Here are the people he's looking at. He has actors lined up to stage a false incursion. That's the old Putin playbook. And I think to some degree they took away those options, at least in a way Putin would want to use them. So I'm not really a Biden basher on this subject. I think they did some novel things and some good things. But in terms of an appetite for putting US troops in Ukraine, I do not see that, nor would I expect that from this administration.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up question for you, Christopher. You worked in the Pentagon, and I certainly have friends in the Pentagon, and I suspect you do too, who argue that Russia is a distraction. We should make allowances for Russia's strategic considerations, its insecurities. After all, the US reacted very badly when there were missiles in Cuba, and Ukraine historically is home to the Kingdom of Rus. And so, you know, there's no reason not to give an assurance to the Russians that, hey, we won't be standing at your doorstep. And the crux of this argument is seduce Russia away from China's arms, just as Kissinger seduced China away from Russia's arm. Use the Kissinger playbook, and then you have encircled China. What do you say to that?
I don't see where Putin would respond positively to American overtures. He views us as part of the problem. There might even be a degree of jealousy. As you rightly point out, there is this quasi-fictional history-ishness. And then there is a decided history, the Kingdom of Rus, that makes this more difficult to predict because there is the strategic value of Ukraine. And then there is what does it really mean to Putin? I hesitate I don't know what would be appealing enough to Putin for him to say, never mind, I'll forgo China and embrace America, particularly since, as you noted, there is a natural shift. What does Russia produce? It's a petrostate. China has a large appetite for O&G, oil and gas. So in the wake of Germany putting the pause there, and keep in mind, Germany doesn't have a lot of options either. They did away with their nuclear. They have no means of receiving LNG. They burned they decided not to build the 2 LNG terminals that they were going to when Trump was threatening to put the kibosh on Nord Stream 2. And then the Netherlands is no longer producing from their large well. What would be appealing enough to Putin? From what I understand, we have suggested to Putin 6 ways to Sunday that we have no intention of bringing Ukraine in to NATO. I think it's fair to say that NATO partners have to decide that, but there's not been an appetite to have Ukraine for a long, long time. So aside from giving him the run of the country, how can we assure him there are not missiles there, that we do not intend to invade? What would be sufficient to entice him? And there aren't very many things that we haven't already offered. Now, contrary-wise, you can say, well, we say, never mind, we won't do sanctions, we won't do this, we won't do that, we'll let the banks open up to the oligarchs and your thugs. But then you also have a sort of lawlessness and a further emboldened Russia. Where do they go from there? So do they have designs on more of the CIS country, more of Eastern Europe? So I struggle to think of something that would be the lock for Putin to say, okay, I'm with you guys. I mean, you mentioned earlier the history of Russia, and Putin came about during the age of Afghanistan. So I think there's a very deeply entrenched mistrust or even distaste for America and anything it represents. Putin is, in my mind, not just a thug. He is, but he's not just that. And I think part of the reason why he's going into Ukraine is because he's driven by that passion, that history, that the greatest loss, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This is integral with who he is. So I just don't think there's anything we can offer that he would say, never mind, I'm against China.
Yeah, you're right. He was posted in East Germany, and he called the local tank commander. And the local tank commander said, Moscow is silent. And that has haunted him since. So is, of course, driven by that memory. He's named after Vladimir, the founder of the Kingdom of Rus, lest we forget. And he also remembers shock therapy with bitterness. He believes, as do many Russians when you talk to them, over vodka, of course, that America planned the collapse of the Russian economy, and then when Russia's economy was not on its knees, it was on its back, then expanded NATO right to Russia's doorstep. So you're absolutely right. There is real resentment there.
So to that point, the question is, how much does Putin blame that NATO expansion on America? I mean, if you watch RTTV, everything is not a European plot. It's always an American plot, right? So let's just assume we did have something really good. How does he sell that to his people? And if they're told for decades that America is, just awful and responsible for so many of these ills, I don't think there is a way to get around that and to get around the deeply embittered history of Putin with regard to more America than just the West. And as I said earlier, it was America that caused the great Afghanistan debacle for the Soviet Union. And I'm sure he blames us for somehow thwarting Soviet greatness even then.
Thank you so much. We'll get you over again for the question answer session. And now, yes, so may now our principal speaker, who's been very patient, some of these questions about Chinese capacity to absorb gap, the entry of China into WTO, US, playing a very duplicitous role vis-a-vis UNCLOS, and that has emboldened China as far as its South China thing, and this, the cyclic wars that are taking place. Would you like to
quite a handful
on this?
I think let's crack on with the gas question. Today, of course, suddenly if you switch the tap off to Europe and turn it to China, then China cannot obviously absorb it. But in the long run, yes, because China can simply lower its imports from Qatar and Saudi Arabia and even Iran, and increase its imports from Russia, and doesn't have gas. And it's a major economy, and it can, over time, certainly absorb much of it. Who knows all of it? Demand and supply adjust. So eventually, that's not that much of a bother. The second question, it's in the long run. In the short run, there'll be transition costs, of course. The second question about WTO. Well, 2001, same year, 9/11, WTO. A number of people I've met from the military, from politics, from academia, all sorts of walks of American life. We have Christopher here. We've had these discussions in our long walks. The 20-year distraction that occurred for America, getting bogged down in the sands of Iraq and the rocks of Afghanistan, was precisely the time when China industrialized. Industrialized big time. Factories left the Midwest, factories left the Deep South. I've driven across America 4 times. 4 times. I've been to hollowed out small towns, shells of buildings. You ask, what is this? We used to make washing machines. We used to make toasters. America increasingly is a place of extremely high skill economy. So you certainly have Silicon Valley, but unknown to many, America is also seeing a great renaissance in a new kind of smart manufacturing. The polymer capital of the world is Akron, Ohio. Most people don't know that. Batesville, Mississippi is where you have incredible manufacturing. They are mixing both software and hardware to make intelligent stuff. Tesla is an example. It's the most shining example where of using software and hardware, but there are lots of other things that are doing so. New methods of production using new materials. So whilst all of that is true, such smart manufacturing, such new materials, such combination of software and hardware do not increase too many jobs. Often they go to PhDs who come out of IITs and institutes of technology, or Technion Israel, or Beida, Tsinghua in China. So the reality is that the multiplier effect and the trickle-down effect is not that much. And so when you drive across America, there are these towns that have a chicken processing plant in the deep south, places which have low-skill taquerias and a gas station, and they eke day by day. They have barely $500 of cash to live by. So as an economy, certainly the 20 years have not been great for the average American. The cost of living has gone up, whether it is healthcare or childcare. And that is not reflected in inflation figures, by the way. Inflation figures are misleading, and Christopher can educate you all about it. And this sort of thing worries conscientious politicians like Christopher, who'd like to take a 5, 10, 20-year worldview. Most politicians have been too busy running elections non-stop every 2 years. So you're fundraising 60, 70% of the time, or whatever, a huge percentage of the time. But the point I'm getting at is that whilst America has become internally divided, and whilst America has seen the cost of living and standard of living, cost of living rise and standard of living fall, and employment and good jobs becoming a real issue, China has risen and risen and risen. So China's entry into the WTO was fundamental. I would argue perhaps even more important than 9/11 in the long run. 9/11 was, yes, it was a terrorist attack. Yes, it was the first attack on American soil. Pearl Harbor happened in an island far away. And yes, the psychological impact of it was tremendous, but it was a bunch of madmen doing this act. They weren't particularly capable or strategic. The war on terror was, I mean, it should have been a sideshow. It became the main show. And so America took its eye off the ball, and China did profit from it. Moving on to the next question, which is...
No, see, what is that reason why US is not joining or signing UNCLOS?
Well, the US has its exceptionalism, and part of it has filled Russian resentment as well. When Putin offered support after 9/11, the US just basically let the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty lapse. And so American exceptionalism, particularly these days, can sometimes benefit them, but sometimes it hurts them. I mean, politically, it's really hard to get anything through, even if you sign a treaty. Yeah, I mean, you signed, the Americans signed 2 climate treaties, and then the next administration said, "Thank you very much. We won't abide by them." The Iran deal, imperfect or terrible, or absolutely catastrophic, as some would call it. But the reality is, after signing the deal, the next president comes along and says, "It's over, chop, chop." So America has undermined its own rules-based order, because America is doing things it did not do in the 50s and 60s. So now when someone says America stands for rules, and people say, yeah, only when they suit you. So this is a degeneration of political culture and strategic culture in America. This is what has happened to all societies, not just America. I think there's been a degeneration in political life, for instance, in the UK. Someone like Boris Johnson is no Winston Churchill, even though he may try to slouch and pout like Churchill. I mean, at the end of the day, he hasn't been a soldier. He hasn't been a spy. He hasn't been a diplomat. He hasn't had a real career. I mean, the man was a tabloid journalist, for Christ's sake. And so you have leaders like that who are populists, who undermine institutions, and that has been across the board. So And that brings me very nicely onto the final question, that is, will there be a war after a century? And I think this is almost inevitable in democracies. We can go back to if we want to, we can go back to none other than Athens. Athens degenerated into a cesspool of vicious, competing interest groups. And mind you, it was a small democracy. And of course, they ended up in the Peloponnesian War. They had the plague. They ended up, and it was a democracy that made Socrates drink poison. He went through due process. So Athens disintegrated, Rome disintegrated. Democracies are not as inevitable and as formidable as the modern ideology trumpets it. Democracies can degenerate into identity groups, interest groups. And what is woke politics all about? At its essence, it is, you know, I am lesbian, I'm gay, I'm bisexual, I'm transgender. And if I remember correctly, and Christopher is here, he can correct me, there was a time when US military soldiers were getting funded for transgender sex change operations, but they couldn't have treatment, IVF fertility treatment. So, and everyone, you know, tomorrow someone will say, I'm a spotted hyena, and there are 5 of us who feel like spotted hyenas, and we need special rights and special bathrooms. And at a time when you have big challenges, the disintegration of America into such identity groups, and let's not even begin about interest groups. There are so many interest groups in America. I mean, for instance, of course, there is the insurance industry in healthcare, but then of course, there are the doctors as well. And then of course, there are the pharmaceutical agencies. And then of course, there are the tort lawyers whom hardly anyone mentions, because if you get one thing wrong, you get sued to oblivion as a doctor. So you prescribe 10 tests when you need 2, or maybe just 1. And so the disintegration of America into interest groups where everyone watches out for their own little tribe and forgets a sense of broader public good and common purpose. So this narrowing of the community, the disintegration of a broader community with public interest in mind, where foreign policy, where sort of politics stops at the shore, and this ability to look beyond your nose in a society with non-stop elections, that is a problem not just with America. With America, it's magnified because it's a superpower. It's a problem for the UK, it is a problem for the EU, it's a problem for India, it's a problem that all democracies face. And democracies, I always point out, I take a contrarian view. Democracies are young and fragile. 1789, there was a king. 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. We have an American sitting here. That war continued till 1782. Women got the vote in 1920 after World War I, because the men were away at the front, conveniently, and pay was going to women. Not just their own pay when they were working in the factories, but the pay of the men at the front. So 1920 is when women get the vote. It's just been a century. The countries such as India got independence starting 1947. Democracy is young and fragile. It's like a teenager. Democracies are exactly like the teenager who may have great potential and do great things, but can also start snorting cocaine and having whiskey. So democracies have to be tended, and they're delicate affairs. And what do they even mean? You could have voting, but people could lose interest. In Russia, in some ways, and I'll bring a name, Vladislav Surkin, who I think is one of the best at this game of myth-making. He is perhaps even cleverer than Joseph Goebbels, and that's saying something. I mean, all the trappings of democracy exist in Russia. Do they have elections? Of course they do. Did Putin step down from power? Of course he did. Does he just send troops over like Hitler? No. First, these republics have declared independence, then there'll be a referendum, the same model as Crimea. So I'll close it at that yes, people forget what war and hardship is like. Democracies and societies decline. And precisely when they decline and you get a political elite and a bureaucratic elite that is out of touch and is unable to factor in long-term interests and they've all shrunk to their narrow sectarian interests, and combine that with identity politics, the risk of conflict shoots sky high. Quickly add, General Asthana had a question for you. He said that the US was in Cold War 1.0, and now under Donald Trump, it went into Cold War 2.0 with China. And now it's reverted to Cold War 1.0. And does it have the ability and the appetite to fight? Because economic sanctions may not prove to be enough. That's the summary of his question.
So earlier we touched on the increasing US reliance on sanctions. I know the SWIFT system was discussed, something I think at this point is unlikely given certain creditors outside of Russia. So I think the US has been overly reliant on sanctions. I think that's one reason why we've seen China develop workarounds within the financial system to avoid those biting. I do think to discuss going from 1.0 to 2.0 and back to 1.0, of course, the Cold War with the Soviet Union was unique, but I don't think we've been quite as whiplashed as some would suggest. I think there has been a very uneasy peace with Russia. Look at the skirmish with in Georgia and Saakashvili thinking we would save him. Look at Crimea. Crimea is interesting because what happened 2 years earlier, as somebody pointed out, President Obama ignored his red line, at which point I think Putin thought, well, he's not going to do anything. And I think that's when the planning for Crimea began. So I think that they are updated for the modern world, but I don't see these extremely clear distinctions aside from the times. These are great power struggles and fights, though they are not as ideological in a way, though they are more economic. The discussion about technology is well taken. I think that's where this is going. China has said that some of their great objectives is to, be the largest producer of chips and, widgets, technological widgets. So I don't view this all as being a complete whipsaw back and forth. But I do think that the U.S. has been overly reliant on sanctions. I also want to address the question about whether or not we've sanctioned China. What is a tariff? What is a sanction? Donald Trump certainly introduced a broad variety of sanctions. China retaliated and tried to hit the farmers in America, which he knew were aligned more with Republicans. So whether or not there's been a sanction per se, there certainly have been economic consequences for various actions. So I don't think it's technically fair maybe to say we haven't sanctioned China that much, but I think we have taken the steps of introducing a lot of very strong tariffs. I also want to address a question I see over here, and I think it's a fair one. Who am I to say? The USA criticizes Russia frequently because of the military activity of Moscow on Ukraine's border with nearly 200,000 soldiers. However, there are 200,000 Chinese soldiers on the border with India, and the USA doesn't frequently criticize China to pull back those forces. The US has an obligation to NATO. So we have a vested interest not only as somebody who supplies the big sack of money, but also, we have a relationship. I mean, we are involved in a defense posture to where an attack on one is an attack on all. Whether or not we should comment more often on, Chinese aggression in India is fair. But I think the reason why the U.S. focuses more on NATO is because, one, the economic consequences that we're seeing now. It was commented, markets are declining down 10% in Russia. It creates tremendous instability among our Western European and Eastern European partners. And we have a responsibility, a formal responsibility there. I would only close with some additional remarks, I suppose, on Chinese nationalism, which is disconcerting to me, because a nationalism that marginalizes risk or fails to recognize internal problems is posed to behave irrationally. I mean, China faces internal unease, a top-down government that's more like a cult of personality at this point, an economy increasingly built on zombie state-owned enterprises, a population decline. We've talked about wounded pride, both in terms of China and Russia, and the classic growing old before becoming rich problem. And I think a lot of actions China takes these days, we say, well, China's becoming stronger and more assertive. I'm not so sure that they're not born of insecurity. I'm not so sure Russia isn't, at least in part, in Ukraine now because they feel that it's slipping away. Polls of Ukrainians and how they perceived Putin a decade ago have completely flipped. And so I think he sees this as the last gasp and the best opportunity. You know, China's also pretty insulated. You know, contrary to the past policy of what was referred to as the grasp the big, let go of the small, you see she increasingly grasps the small to the point where power is tremendously concentrated in Xi, who is often called the chairman of everything, with little outside understanding as to the rationale for the policy decisions. And I want to emphasize that misunderstanding is a lot of times what sets off these hot wars from these cold wars. Cold War 1.0, to go back to that, has lessons to offer about miscommunication and misunderstanding. So I think we need to continue to keep this dialogue going so that we understand why Xi is doing what he is, without regard to whether or not he should be there or how power is concentrated. I'll just close by saying, you know, I think of Russia and China and the US as kind of teenagers. The US is like the morose teenager who sulks in a room all day, and Russia's the teen with cigarettes in its shoulder and a tattoo and wants a motorcycle, and China is an overly confident teen who feels the keys to the family car are a birthright. And none are clear-headed and none are very true. I do think that American values retain their cachet around the world in a way that China's have not. I mean, who wants to live in a surveillance state? But does the West have the will to defend those values? So I think that is a tremendous concern of mine. And with that, I'll close.
Thank you very much. Your concluding remarks. You
Well,
have anything to say?
I just have.
You have to respond to each question.
No, I just have one thing to say. The lady said that the Cold War, the first Cold War, was military. I would say the first Cold War was everything. It was military, it was ideology, it was economics. And eventually what destroyed the Soviet Union was empty bread shelves. Blue jeans and rock and roll won because they were far more attractive than Brezhnev, who wanted to live in a surveillance state, to echo Christopher. And the Soviet Union was a surveillance state. Beria was in charge and people were getting killed left, right, center. Millions of kulaks died in the 30s. In fact, Ukrainian kulaks died in the 30s. They suffered. And there's that burning resentment in Ukraine as a result. Just as there's Russian resentment, there is Ukrainian resentment. And the Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis in World War II when they first arrived, some of them, the Western ones. Now, of course, when they realized that the Nazis thought of all Slavs as Untermensch, then they quickly turned around because the Nazis weren't exactly nice. But we must never forget that Stalin killed more people in Ukraine than Hitler. So history is a way of coming back. There is never really an end to history. And Christopher's analogy of two teenagers is right. I'll add to that just one line. I would say that we're living at a time when political systems, both in the US and Europe, as well as in Russia and China, are under tremendous internal strain. It's the pressure cooker effect. In Russia, what happens if Vladimir Putin slips in the bathroom and cracks open his skull? What happens if Xi Jinping trips over, has a concussion, and then ends up in coma like our late Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh, with whom I worked for a bit? What happens? What is the succession plan? There is a massive problem in both these authoritarian states. Power is concentrated, and they are no more immortal than Genghis Khan or the great pharaohs or you and me. We will all shuffle out of our mortal coil, to quote or paraphrase Shakespeare very poorly. That's a big problem there. Institutions have weakened. They've all become more and more, these states and societies, engineered around personality cults. So there's a huge weakness, as Christopher points out, both in Russia and China. Having said that, there's a huge internal weakness, I don't need to repeat it, in the European and American democracies. The opposite problem of centralization, fragmentation. What is it to be American today? Is it about being a consumer and going and buying the cheapest stuff of Amazon and tattooing yourself and claiming an identity? Or will the Americans fight for and die for something? They did between 1776 to 1782. The question is, what will they now? And the question is even more profound for the Europeans, because as someone said way back, the British had traded their empire for false teeth. They all have universal health care. They all have very cushy and comfortable welfare states. But then if you spend so much on welfare, you can't spend on military. And when people are just too comfortable, then they are not entrepreneurial. They are not risk takers. And they don't want to fight. And at some point, Putin comes along and says, hang on a minute, I can have that share of your pie. What are you going to do about it? And of course, there is legitimate anger, somewhat legitimate anger and grievance, because someone like Jeffrey Sachs did demolish almost single-handedly the Russian economy. Shock therapy was ghastly for the Russians. Hyperinflation, no health care, no bread. It was worse than communism. So we are living in a very complex, torturous world. And yes, I agree with our friends, our Sri Lankan friends. This is a time of flux, but this is also a time of Cold War. Because of that flux, it is also a time of great power tension. It's a time of the Thucydides trap. And if someone somewhere loses his or her rag, more likely his rag, we could descend into hot war. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you. And okay. So finally, I just want to say that presently we are really into a zero-sum game kind of a scenario. And none of the sides are actually backing off, and everybody is trying to use this, what you call is the multi-domain warfare approach to achieve its strategic objectives. At the end of the day, I don't think this can continue the way it is. Russians definitely have certain genuine concerns as far as Carpathian Gap is concerned. That's 500 meters in Eastern Europe. Those concerns have to be allayed by Europe and United States of America. Otherwise, Russia is not going to compromise on anything. Similarly, Chinese in their own right, they feel that they need to be accommodated in the Indo-Pacific construct. And it's no more that they would be led by an American crafted world order international system. So they also want certain stakes in that. And third thing is actually America, Pax Americana has lost its sheen. And it is time for America to reinvent itself, become more competitive, become a genuine democracy and provide leadership by leading from the front in terms of what the democratic values should be, and provide an alternate model to the world which requires development. For example, African continent, some of these East European countries, some of the European countries, they require development, and Chinese with their deep pockets and very quick decision making are filling up that vacuum. Unless the world gets an alternate model, that this competition is going to stay. So my own vision is that I think in coming one decade, this is going to play out at level that we are seeing it. There'll be ups and downs, and maybe after a decade that these great powers will probably learn to reach a, an inflection point of some kind of an equilibrium, and we will probably have maybe a new cycle of balance of power. Till then, I don't visualize there's going to be a hot war because the cost for everybody is extremely high. But this multi-domain warfare, we're seeing a classic case and example. I think this is the new flavor of the season, and all countries who are indulging in it, they should be prepared, particularly a country like India. I don't think today United States of America is braced for fighting in the multi-domain warfare vis-a-vis Chinese and Russians who have achieved great skills and mastery in prosecuting, planning and prosecuting this kind of a warfare. So with this, all it remains for me is to thank Mr. Atul, who has enlightened us with his very deep insight, and we have a relationship with fair observers. We are going to do more and more number of events with them. And Christopher, for him particularly, it's very awkward time to be with us because I think it's midnight there. So thanks a lot.
It's 3 a.m.
And for all the audience and those people who are digitally connected. And we look forward to more such participation in times to come.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.